Okay, welcome back. Let's get back at this. We're going to look today at the fifth part of Standage's 6 Glasses of World History, and this is going to be all about tea. Last time we kind of left on this slide the drinks that conquered the world, and that's really a good way to look at this because it is tea that sometimes people think of as driving the force that drove the British to want to colonize the world. That taste for tea pushed them to do many things that they probably would not have done otherwise. So these are the questions you need to be thinking about as you go through the presentation, and hopefully you'll be able to answer when it's over. Okay, so better to be deprived of food for 3 days than tea for 1. That's a Chinese proverb, and China is where we really need to start this thing. I think the empires of tea, and we think of the empire being the British Empire, but the Chinese Empire was probably the biggest and greatest in world's history before the British take it to another level. But what the Chinese had done was on a grand scale. So it's a daily drink in China by the 3rd century CE. So you're talking about the year 300, 400. It is a daily drink for most citizens, most people who are living in China. Played a leading role in the expansion of the imperial industry and the imperial industrial might of Great Britain many centuries later. And it's this battle for tea that is symbolic of the struggle to lead the world. And of course, we know Great Britain kind of takes that over. And if Britain is rising in power, China is falling in power. The English around the world could drink tea whether they were a colonial administrator in India or a London businessman. The tea never set on the British Empire, which meant that it was always tea time somewhere. So tea time and that ceremony devoted to it, those ideas of ceremonial tea start in Asia, but the Britons love it and take it over as well. They look at it as a very sophisticated and civilized way of leading their life. So the Industrial Revolution is quite a powerful thing. We'll study that this spring as well. It comes right after the Atlantic Revolutions, the American, Haitian, French, Latin American, South American revolutions. The Industrial Revolution is really powered by tea and those tea breaks that British workers would take. Not at the beginning because tea was expensive, but as time went along, the tea break became a really important function for industries because it gave people a chance to take a break from their work, to have a civilized drink, and to relax a little bit, and then get back to work. Also, there were lots of unintended, probably accidental, health benefits. Certainly, when you're talking about water quality in industrialized Europe, the water supply in highly populated areas is going to be very, very polluted and can be polluted. Boiling of the water helped to take a lot of those pollutants straight out of it. So no wonder they liked tea. It was a healthy drink.
More popular than coffee, stronger than a Coca-Cola, able to start revolutions with a single drop. When we tell you what this week's superfood is, you might say something like, "That's not a food at all." And to some extent, you'd be right. After water, it's the most popular beverage in the world. So what's today's superfood? Its name is tea. Green tea. Green tea became a daily drink in China around the 3rd century AD, but it was used as medicine almost 3,000 years earlier. Have you ever heard the expression, "I wouldn't do that for all the tea in China"? Well, that's a lot of tea. Tea plants are native to China. Green tea grows in tropical and subtropical climates all over the world. That said, China is still the world's #1 producer of our superfood, green tea. So, what is green tea? And how is it different from black tea? Green tea and black tea are both mature leaves from the Camellia sinensis plant. Green tea is just a less fermented version. This means it has more antioxidants than black tea because the fermentation process removes these healthy molecules. Green tea is chock full of antioxidants, especially catechins, an antioxidant compound linked to everything from weight loss to Alzheimer's prevention. Fresh dried tea is up to 30% catechins by weight. As tea ferments, the catechins lose potency, so go for green tea instead of black tea and reap the benefits like reduced cancer risk, a stronger immune system, and lower blood pressure. The National Institute of Health found that people who drank 1 cup of green tea each day were 46% less likely to suffer from high blood pressure from those who didn't drink green tea. An 8-ounce cup of green tea is also almost half of the vitamin C you'll need in a whole day. Black tea doesn't have nearly the amount. Not only will that hot cup of tea soothe you when you're feeling sick, but it'll help you keep your immune system nice and healthy. Green tea next to another favorite caffeinated beverage. Most people are coffee drinkers or tea drinkers. Some are both. And both coffee and tea have proven benefits. But caffeine is also really addictive and actually harmful in larger doses. The Mayo Clinic says that consuming more than 300 milligrams a day can result in everything from insomnia, to muscle tremors and hypertension. Drinking tea, even a few cups a day, will give you that feel-good benefit of dopamine without the ugly side effects.
The story of tea is a story of imperialism, industrialism, and world domination 1 cup at a time. So let's start with Chinese tea, and that's where it's coming from. That's where it's being grown. It's almost a flat monopoly, although Stanage mentions that there were tea trees or plants and bushes growing in India, and the British didn't even really realize that. They end up investing a lot to try to make that happen, to break that monopoly that the Chinese have. But it all kind of flows along this, which is the Silk Road. We'll learn about this in the first semester. And these Silk Road trading patterns that connect with the ocean roads and then the sand roads of North Africa are bringing products to Europe. There's not much that Europeans have that the Chinese need or want, but the Europeans have a strong hunger for tea and the spices and things that they can't get in Europe or grow in Europe because of growing conditions. The Silk Road also is not only going to trade tea and other products, but ideas like Buddhism, which spread throughout China. Interestingly enough, the Chinese look at merchants at the bottom of their classes. They think merchants are a pest. They don't really like merchants very much, and they go through ups and downs with Confucius ways in thinking. But throughout much of their history, they look down upon merchants, kind of like people would if you get a knock at the door at dinner time and here comes someone trying to sell you something. Mom and dad might not be too happy if they get phone calls all night long from people trying to have them buy insurance or some other crazy scam. That's the way the Chinese looked at merchants, but yet the merchants are what made China an economic power. So easy to prepare, again, medicinal qualities, because tea would kill bacteria that cause things like cholera and typhoid and dysentery, all these waterborne illnesses that today are still a problem throughout the world. And though it fell from favor during Mongol rule in China, the Mongols kind of come down from the northern part of China. They control China and then much else of Europe for quite a while. They're not tea drinkers. They're different kind of folk. It already had spread to Japan, tea drinking, and is an important part of their culture, and other parts of Asia. And of course, tea was introduced into Europe before coffee was. But tea was much more expensive. It's traveling along a further path to get to Europe, and the Chinese can jack the price up because they're the only ones making it. In the 18th century, Britain was won over by tea thanks in a big part to the British East India Trading Company, which is not part of the British government. And there were the Dutch East India Trading Companies as well. They really functioned as their own like floating countries, if you will. They had their own armies, their own sort of governmental policies and boards within them. They were British, many of the citizens in the British East India Trading Company, and power was handed to them to exclusively trade, but was a strong connection in many ways between the British government and the tea trading companies. But opium becomes a big factor. The British figure out that they can grow down here in India, they can grow some opium plants, some poppy plants, and get the drug out of that and trade it to China for tea. Now, this isn't a straight up trade, as we'll see in a couple minutes, but it's part of a way to offer something to the Chinese that they don't have, something of great value, and believe me, it works. Not opium, I don't know anything about opium, but it worked in the case to give the British what the Chinese wanted and vice versa. We'll see that in a minute. From a limited body of merchants, the India Company have become the arbiters of the East. The arbiters, the people who are running and controlling the East. This is Standage, page 177. So tea as a British high culture is part of marriage ceremonies. There are tea shops for women, so women quite involved with tea. Tea parties, afternoon tea, tea gardens, all kinds of tea things. Yet tea also shows up in the working class, and as I talked about this before, factory production and the introduction of the tea break, which you might think sounds silly. We're going to take a break for tea. Tea break in many cases served as a snack break. They didn't get much chance to eat, and they went to work before the sun came up. They left when the sun has gone down to go home. This was a pretty crummy, nasty place to work, and you never saw the sun much because the smoke that billowed over the towns kind of blocked that out. Plus, you were in the factory working in some terrible conditions. You did have a break for what they called dinner, which I believe was like a lunch break, but in the afternoon you'd get a tea break, and what tea did was help to like tamp down hunger feelings, and it does that. You can have tea which will kind of satiate yourself and you won't be as hungry. You can get through the rest of your day. Very, very difficult work that these people and many children did during the Industrial Revolution. What do you see happening with the medicinal qualities of boiling the tea and fighting the waterborne illnesses? First of all, infant survival rates begin to increase. There's more people that the European countries can be using in the factory, and you can pack them into these cities like they did. The marketing of tea and tea paraphernalia provided an additional evidence of consumerism emerging in England. So you're going to see people buying products, and some of the first products they're going to want and buy are tea sets and tea itself and tea pots to create the tea culture and keep it moving. See a couple examples on this page of possibly more wealthy tea drinkers in the top two pictures there, the left side. You've got the photographs of old glosses in the streets of Glasgow, old closes in the streets of Glasgow. This is 1868 and 1877, so you're talking about a time period during the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. You've got an age breakdown there in terms of the distribution in cotton factories. Now pay close attention to these kind of graphics. You'll see this on the AP test. You'll see it on many of our tests where they're going to give you documents. The quote there by Isaac D'Israeli, English critic and historian. This is something you could see in a list of different documents. Documents being passages or things that have been written down in the past. It could be a picture or a photograph. It could definitely be a chart, a graphic, or something like the age distribution in cotton factories. They'll ask you a general question overall, and then you'll need to tie the evidence together in a thesis-based argument to answer the question. This is difficult work. It's the work of doing historiographical work, and we're going to focus a lot on that in class and help you get there for the AP test. So what is Disraeli saying? I think this is a really interesting quote, so I'm going to read this one. The progress of this famous plant has been something very like the progress of truth. And he's talking about one of the famous plants in England, northern England. Suspected at first, though very palatable to those who had the courage to taste it. Resisted as it encroached, abused as its popularity spread, and established its triumph at last in cheering the whole land, from the palace to the cottage, only by slow and resistless efforts of time and its own virtues. He's kind of comparing the spread of tea and people enjoying it to also this plant that had functioned as part of the Industrial Revolution. So at first people weren't very happy with it, but over time this becomes a cog in the Industrial Revolution. It's a cog in this major factor in improving people's lives. And you might argue that working in a factory isn't a very good thing, especially for children to be doing, but they're making money they weren't going to be making potentially in the rural farms. Tea became a personal steam power for the individual factory worker of the Industrial Revolution. It breaks the elevated levels of stress, which obviously you're going to have. It helped to take their minds off hunger during work. And a good example of, if I gave you a tea break every day during class, in the middle of class, you'd probably be looking forward to that. We're going to be working pretty hard in class this year. You're going to be asking you to do a lot of hard work in class and a lot of writing. And I'd say, it's tea break time. Time to relax and take your mind off the work we're doing. You'd be like, I like tea. I'm down with some. Give me some tea. You'd be putting your pinky out there and everything, drinking your tea. I can't quite do this with my coffee cup, but you got my coffee cup's too big. Coffee. See, that's not right. I should be drinking tea for this, but I need something a little stronger. The working class eventually embraced tea as well, like I mentioned earlier. And you've got another example there of the boiling of the water helping to kill disease. You see the empires of tea kind of spread in a revolutionary sense. So remember, there's some carryover here with coffee and tea. Tea introduced into Europe before coffee is, but coffee kind of takes off first, and then later tea elevates in popularity. So in America, everybody knows most people know the famous story of the Boston Tea Party. It's a little bit more complicated than what you might learn in 8th grade U.S. history. Americans complained pretty heavily about, this taxation, and they had taxation without representation. I'm not saying that Americans didn't at that time. But the tax rate on American colonists was so low compared to actual British citizens in London that it was a joke. I mean, the tax rate was tiny in comparison. It was more or less an idea of freedom, this distance across the Atlantic Ocean, that people wanted to break free of King George and the British and kind of establish their own way. But not everyone. There were certainly lots of loyalists to the British cause. It wasn't the tea that was most upsetting. It was the fact that American pirates or smugglers, basically, who wanted to bring tea in themselves, or and we've talked about this before with the rum and sugar and molasses, and they could get that straight from the Caribbean. Why would they want to go in a different direction, have to go and pay the tax on imports that the British were causing them to do. So the demand of West Indian sugar was driven by the consumption of tea. The British East India Company, their policy soon became so important that it was indistinguishable from the British governmental policy, and they pretty much give them full rights to do whatever they want to make money and make profit. The Tea Act of 1773 is tea smuggling had driven the East India Company into financial difficulties. They were losing money, and the British government gave the company the rights to ship tea directly from India to America, and avoiding that government import duty for the company. They didn't have to pay an import duty because it wasn't coming into Great Britain. It was going directly to America. So what did they do? They're basically giving them monopolistic control over the tea trade in America to the East India Tea Company, the British East India Tea Company. So the Boston Tea Party is basically Americans who dress as, and you see them up here in this picture, this is an actual picture of them dumping tea into the Boston Harbor. You can see that's the Boston Harbor. I don't know if you've ever been to Boston. It looks just like that. And their cargo here, exactly like that. I don't know, you might think they didn't have cameras then, but let go of those ideas and, kind of let your mind go here. Those are Legos. Sorry. But the Boston Tea Party, these guys dressed up as Mohawk Indians and dumped 342 chests of tea into the Boston Harbor as protest. And this proved to be a decisive step towards the American Revolution. And I think that it was definitely a rallying cry. Let me flip back here, because I don't want to forget about this. This is Elizabeth Abbott's book called Sugar, A Bittersweet History. Of course, all of this tea fervor and popularity for tea also drives the need for people to import sugar and get sugar from the ground and from the sugarcane plantations. This required extreme labor in terribly harsh and hot conditions. And so the drive for tea is also driving slavery. And it's a big factor in world history. We're always thinking of not those in power necessarily, not the people who did things. And you can notice there's not many persons' names that we mention throughout this whole entire book. We're looking at big picture things, and we're looking at what's the impact on women? What's the impact on slaves? What's the impact on the regular person who's living through world history? And that's just what world history is. There's no other way around it. AP world history, certainly. So the Opium War, you talk about impact on regular people in world history. European technology was beginning to pull ahead of the Chinese. And why is that? The Chinese were so far vastly superior to Europeans in every way in the centuries just before this. They had the ability to sail across oceans in an amazing way. We'll learn about Zheng He and his fleet of ships, which are somewhat similar to these ships down here, the Chinese ships that are being blown apart by the British ships in the distance. But anyway, the Chinese go through this period of kind of like a cycle where they are very powerful and they want to explore a bit and they want to project their power out towards other people. And then they go through time periods where the dynasty that leads them kind of collapses. And when it does, they go back to their root Confucian philosophy, which is forget about outsiders. We can do this on our own. We don't need anyone else, and especially anyone who's not Chinese, who is a barbarian. So the British wanting to poke holes in the Chinese trading ports and get the tea out of there, and wanting to trade a product with them, this is something the Chinese government is saying no to at this point. They are very against the idea of opening ports to the Europeans, and they'll trade some tea with them, but the price continues to go up and up and up. So the British turn to opium to get their tea fix. And how do they do this? They easily cultivate and prepare it in India, and then they trade it to the Chinese. And opium is massively addictive. You can see the two guys here at the bottom who are smoking from pipes with opium, and it is highly addictive, leads to lethargic behavior, and people like this guy here who just waste away, and some of them die from their addiction to opium. The picture at the top is a British person dumping opium into a Chinese person, and you get the sense from the cartoon that they're saying negative things. The guns behind the British with the opium here can tell that there's going to be a forceful nature to this whole thing. So the Chinese tea monopoly would be offset by a very cunning and cruel British game of opium monopoly. It's not trade straightforward. They're being very sneaky about this. They're sneaking in the opium into China. It's not a one-for-one trade. Here's some opium for your tea. But it's a system where the British companies are going to make profit that they haven't been making, which will afford them to also then purchase tea and get their trade imbalance straightened out. In fact, exports of opium to China increased 250-fold to reach 1,500 tons of opium being traded to China a year in the year 1830, and that is just a lot of drugs. The British balance of trade was restored, but then the Chinese government said, whoa, we're putting a hold to this. And they closed down the trading ports, and that kind of forces the British hand. Are they going to feel so strongly about this that they're going to go to war over this? And they do. The Opium War of 1839 to 1842 was a quick, decisive, and basically complete domination by the British. Their gun power and ship power alone quickly knocked out any Chinese advances. This is a groundbreaking moment in world history. Massive balance of power shifts from the East and the Chinese, who had been at the top of world domination for the entire first semester, to now you have the Europeans rise. And this is a big moment in that sense. It's not a very nice thing, what they're doing, but they seize power and take control, and much of it's because of their technology. I mean, gunpowder, where does it come from? It comes from China. But the Europeans take it, and the competitive engines that run Europe, those little tiny city-states at first, and then your places like France and England, Spain, Portugal, later Italy, that are driving innovation and trade and then exploration. They're improving at such a rapid pace, where in China, everything is kind of tamped down. We're good, we don't need anything, we don't need outsiders, and that catches up with the Chinese here for certain. So, what's the legacy of the British tea imperial policy? The legacy really is the creation of the world's greatest empire, and you can see it on the map above. It's a different way of looking at the world, obviously. It's a different kind of map here. But the United States, certainly the 13 colonies, were once British as well. So they lose the American colonies over this, and they probably extended themselves too far with that. But they get control over much of India and Southeast Asia, Australia and many of these islands, and much of Africa, and parts of South America and some other parts of Latin America, all of Canada, of course. Europeans, especially the British, create an empire that stretches around the world. India, very tightly controlled by the British. So if it wasn't for tea trade, I'm not so sure, and the opium industry there, I'm not so sure that India would have been tightly integrated. But the British felt like that's a place where they could take advantage of the massive numbers of people and put them to work as British subjects. We're going to learn much more about this during the school year, and this is one of the hardest areas for students to understand. That's why I'm spending some time on it with this video, because students really struggle with colonialism and imperialism. It's a tough thing to get through their heads, but what happens here, tea, the preferred beverage of this nation, and for a century or so becomes the unrestrained global power, a superpower unlike what the world has ever seen before. Britain's remained devoted to tea ever since. and really, really good documentary here. So if you have some time, you've read the book, you've gone through the notes, you feel really comfortable, you want to get some review, maybe understand tea culture better or British culture, Victoria Wood's Nice Cup of Tea. This is part 1. I think it's an hour. And that's part 2, I think, is an hour. Is really an interesting look, and she's kind of entertaining through it as well. But it's obviously not something you must watch for the test or quiz, but included in here, we may see parts of it during class. So think about these questions, focus on them for the first week. If you can understand these questions well, you should be quite prepared for the first week of school. Next, we'll look at Coca-Cola, the 6th drink, number 6, and final drink in Standage's book, Coca-Cola and the Rise of America. Thanks a lot. DFTBA.